right, everybody, welcome back. I hope you're enjoying the day so far. So David set me up in a really good spot because I'm going to talk about a lot of layouts and positioning and whatnot, but for web developers, which I think is really important because this talk is about responsive and adaptive techniques or tactics for Blazor applications. And now that Maui's come out, and we can put Maui inside of, or sorry, Blazor inside of a web view and run Blazor applications natively on the desktop and on iOS and on Android. That makes adaptive and responsive even more important with Blazor because now we're running on mobile devices. In my opinion, we should be building things for mobile devices already on the web, but that's not always the case, especially when you consider line of business applications and stuff. My name's Ed Charbeneau. I'm a principal developer advocate for Progress Software, and I'm primarily focused on the Telerik UI for Blazor right now. You can find my free beginner's guide to Blazor up on our website at telerik.com/whitepapers. I still have my Twitter handle up here. I don't use that very often anymore. You catch me more on LinkedIn these days, Mastodon as well. And we have our own streaming channel on Twitch at the Progress office. So we are on twitch.tv/codeit live. So come check us out there. We are streaming all of the time. Lots of fun stuff on there. All of our team is on there doing Angular, React, JavaScript, Blazor, and lots of .NET stuff. So I've been a web developer for quite some time. I've been talking about responsive design, I think, for 12, 15 years, something like that now. I jumped on the bandwagon really early on before anybody else was even really doing much of this. And what we were doing back then is we kind of had this ballpark figure that we worked with. And we were like, all right, everybody has different size monitors on their desktop, but generally speaking, they're about 960 pixels. That's a good average. We'll take that. We'll design for that. And there was actually a really great framework out there called 960GS or 960 Grid System. It was one of the first grid system frameworks that was out there, and it let us lay out our applications with these nice grid semantics. And as things progressed over the years, we kind of got to the point where people started using different devices to access the internet and web applications. So today, people use their smartphones more than their desktops to access the web and web apps. And that's a problem for us web developers, especially back in the day when we were targeting 960 pixels for everything. So the real world looks a lot more like this. We've got phones, tablets, watches, laptops, cars. I had to add a new one to this slide. Again, this slide, I think I started about 12 to 15 years ago, and the list of things keeps growing, and VR recently got added to that list. So believe it or not, if you package up your web application, doesn't matter if it's JavaScript based or .NET based with Blazor, and you make that a progressive web application, you can deploy that thing to an Oculus Quest. That's pretty cool. So you never know where people are going to run your app. These devices are always changing, and so are the sizes of those devices. So we want responsive web design. We want our content to be flexible, the layouts to be flexible. And one of the tools that we use to make things adapt really well is something called a media query. I'll explain what media queries are, but first I want to kind of touch on some frameworks that use these techniques. And you might be familiar with these, if not familiar with them, at least heard of them. I know a lot of people use Bootstrap and have over the last probably 10 years used Bootstrap to build applications. It's a nice framework for getting started and building out some responsive applications. It has these responsive mechanics built into it, these grid layout systems that we can define different screen sizes for. Kind of a newer one that's gained a lot of traction lately is Tailwind. So Tailwind's gained a lot of steam, and Tailwind uses a lot of these techniques behind the scenes. And there's kind of a syntax with Tailwind that's almost a one-for-one with CSS. It's kind of an odd one for me. Not a huge fan myself because I don't care for it doesn't mean that you shouldn't use it. If you're productive with it, that's great. I just find it a little strange. I'd rather just learn CSS myself. And that's what we're going to do a little bit of today. We're going to learn some CSS techniques. And even if you use these two frameworks that I mentioned, Bootstrap or Tailwind, the stuff that I'm going to show you is going to help you at least understand those two frameworks a lot better. If not, maybe guide yourself towards more CSS natively without the help from these frameworks. So just a quick example, if you're not familiar with responsive web design, we're talking about websites or web applications that can expand or contract with screen sizes and display things nicely no matter what the device is. So on the far left, we've got our desktop scenario, and we've got plenty of room here to lay out our application. And then if we open that same website on a tablet, we might need to move some things around a little bit just to accommodate that smaller screen size. And then when we get to the phone, we're on a mobile device, we might have to order everything up in a nice straight column to make sure it's readable on a mobile phone. We'll dive into media queries here in just a second, but first, I want to get into CSS Grid. We need to lay out our application, and there's a couple ways to do it. One of those things is CSS Grid. Now, CSS Grid is important. It follows kind of those mechanics that we see in those CSS frameworks like Tailwind, Bootstrap, and even the really old one that I mentioned, 960 GS. Grid systems have been used in layouts since print. So a lot of the mechanics that we use for laying out our applications come from print design and physical design. Grid system is really great because it's a two-dimensional grid-based layout system. So we're talking about two dimensions here, two axes. So we're talking about having columns and rows. And I know that kind of sounds kind of intuitive. It is a grid, but we're going to talk about Flexbox as well. And Flexbox is a single dimensional layout. So Flexbox goes in one direction. It's a flow layout system. And with a flow layout system, what we're going to do is when our content gets to the end of a boundary, it's going to start wrapping again from the start. And we can also define different directions for that flow. So we can go right to left, left to right, top down, bottom up. And both of these things can be used together to build different types of layouts. Choosing between the two depends on how much you really care about alignment. So I've designed some applications before where I was struggling to get the elements in my application to just line up correctly. And I started out with a Flexbox layout. And I was kind of trying to really get centered on this this pixel perfect display where things were lining up well. And I was like, I added all this special stuff to my Flexbox layout to get these things to line up right. And then it kind of came to me that I was actually trying to do things in a two-dimensional array of items. And I just switched over to grid and deleted about half the code that I wrote. So keep in mind when you're writing these layouts, how these two different layout systems work and what their intentions are. If you really care about being pixel perfect on these edges like this, or like this, or especially both, you want your CSS grid. If you want something that can lay out in different directions, you're not really concerned whether those items line up or not when they're laying out in those directions, then Flexbox is probably what you want. And you can actually mix and match these together. We'll have some examples here. We're actually going to break this down, and then we'll jump into what those media queries are. So I've got an application here. It's really basic. We're just going to move some squares around the screen, but it's going to teach you how to do CSS Flexbox and CSS Grid. And it is written in Blazor. There's not really much Blazor to it. We'll get to Blazor in just a little bit. These are just some web standard technologies that we're going to start with, and then we'll move into some very specific Blazor things that let us do some really cool stuff at runtime. So first we have a bunch of elements that are just kind of laid out on this page. If we look at the code for this, we'll jump into our app here. I've got a grid example, and we'll make this as big as we can to make sure folks in the back of the room here can see and everybody online can see really well. We have a top level div that just has a class on it called main layout. And all of our content just gets kind of dropped inside there. There's a bunch of div elements in here. These could be any element, by the way. They will follow the rules of the main layout once we create them. But right now, they don't really have any layout rules. It's just listing them straight out onto the page. So what I'd really like to do with this is, first of all, split these things up a little bit, and then maybe give them some grid dimensions so they have a nice layout on the page here. So on this application, it is a Blazor app. I'm going to use some CSS isolation here. I've got a CSS file that correlates to my, whoa, super zoom is really hard to control on a trackpad. I've got grid.razor and grid.razor.css. So that grid.razor.css is my CSS isolation, which is kind of just bundling the markup with a very specific set of CSS rules. So we're going to jump into that CSS isolation there. And I've gone and commented some of these things out so you don't have to watch me type them in real time and fat finger a bunch of stuff in a live demo, because that's no fun. The first thing I want to do is I want to target that main layout with a selector. And I'm going to give that a display grid property. When I give that a display grid property, just that alone is going to change how that layout looks. Remember, they were all just kind of crammed up on top of each other before. Now they've kind of started laying out on the page. The reason for that is as soon as I signed that a grid layout, it actually gave it a default of one column and one row. So that's the actual default layout for a grid. So just that alone gives me a little bit to work with. What I'd like to do is create some space between those items. They're just kind of cramped up together. So I'm going to add one more property here called gap. So if you're not familiar with gap, I'm sure you've probably heard of padding and margin before. You're like, oh, great, another white space property that we have to remember. But gap is actually really important. And it's a newer property, but it's something that's special for Grid and Flexbox. And the reason it's special for Grid and Flexbox is when we use gap with the Grid and Flexbox, it's smart enough to know that we only want white space between the items. We don't want white space before and after. So if we were doing this prior to CSS Flexbox and Grid and Gap, what we'd have to do is give it some kind of padding, go find the first item, remove the padding from the top, go find the last item, remove the padding from the bottom, or things start to calculate weird and you get double white space at the top and the bottom of your layout. So now we have Gap. And you can also set gap for the column or the row or the column separately. So you can have those both dimensions there. If you just set gap by itself, it will cover both the X and the Y coordinates. Now we have our grid, but we haven't really defined any columns yet. So that's what we're going to do next. There's a couple ways that we can define these columns. One of them is to say grid-template-columns. And then we use a special syntax here. Now, if you're coming from the XAML side of development, a lot of this might sound somewhat familiar so far because there are similar layout elements in XAML. What's a little bit different here is we have this FR unit. And what FR is, it's basically a fraction. In XAML, I believe this is a star. So we could say star here in XAML. In HTML, we need to say FR, and it's a ratio. I'm going to say I want a 3-to-5 ratio here. I want 3 fractions by 5 fractions. So the first column is going to be 3 fractions wide. The second column is going to be 5 fractions wide. And just by defining that, you can see those lay out. The next thing I want to do is come back and set up some features for the row. And for row, I'm going to use a similar template, but this time instead of saying grid template, I'm going to say grid auto rows. Now, what auto and template do differently is auto will repeat the template over and over. So if I say grid auto rows, 2 fractions by 1 fraction, that means I'm going to repeat a 2 by 1 template. Oops, I didn't save. That always helps. You always want to make sure you save. There we go. So you can see the first row is twice as large as the second row, and that pattern repeats over and over again. So that's what that auto property does. Now, one thing that's nice about CSS Grid is it's already flexible because we're using those fractional values. And you always want to try to use those fractional values when you can, because if you use percentages or other pixel values, things start to fall out of the layout and they become kind of hard to fix. So try to use fractional values before you go reaching out for any of the other units that you have in HTML. So the next thing I want to do with this is I want to make this work on a small device. So right now I have this 2-column layout, but on a smaller screen, that doesn't quite look right. So that's where I need this media query to come in. What a media query does is it inspects the screen size, and it says that the screen is capable of displaying a minimum of 768 pixels. And when I'm inside of that condition, I can apply some additional CSS to change the layout. And this is how those frameworks work, the Bootstrap and Tailwind. When you see row, column, dash, small dash, and a number, they're actually just referring to something that uses a media query behind the scenes. So this is exactly how all of those systems work. Now, to make this layout work properly, I'm going to use a method called mobile first design. And right now I've been doing it backwards. So I've been designing for the desktop screen. So I'm going to take these two templates and remove them for a moment. And if I do that, remember the default is a single column. So that's actually what I want on a mobile device. So I'm going to scroll down in my CSS code here and on comment my media query. And let's see, we've got a lot of comments around there. First thing I want to do is say that if I can display at least a minimum width 768 pixels, then we're going to put some special CSS code here to override that layout. Now, media queries always read backwards to me for some reason. I think because it says min width, I think of smaller than, but it's actually saying I have a minimum capability of doing this, so I'm bigger than. And I think a lot of people have that, so you're going to be able to use greater than, less than symbols in here pretty soon. It's part of the upcoming CSS spec. So that confusion hopefully will go away for most people, including myself, because I know I make that mistake quite often. And we're going to go ahead and add in those same 2 grid templates that we had before, but now they're inside of a media query. So they will only trigger when we reach a screen size of 768 pixels or bigger. So now you can see that those 2 columns will shrink down and become 1 column. Now I do have some color coding CSS in here that's doing a little bit of the styling magic, just so you can see the different items and highlight those. But I just use the same methodologies to color the boxes as I do to display them. All right, so that's CSS Grid. So those are some of the main things that you need to know about CSS Grid. The next thing I want to do is talk about Flexbox. This one might be hard to see. We'll zoom this in quite a bit. I've got a couple items in here that I want to lay out with a Flexbox layout. And again, if you're coming from the XAML side of things, that stack panel is going to be very similar to what we're doing with this Flexbox layout. So with Flexbox, we're only considering the one dimension here, either top to bottom or left to right or right to left. So we'll go ahead and open up our stack.razor component here. And we also have a corresponding CSS file for it. And I've already started to label these what I want them to do. The first set of items, today, partially cloudy participation, is going to be a vertical stack. So if we go over to our CSS file and begin writing our CSS code, first thing I want to do is set display flex. The default for display flex is going to be right to left. I want this to be a vertical layout though. So let's go back and change this. And I'm going to set this to a column. So when I say flex direction column, that means I want to start at the top and work my way down. You can reverse this order as well. And we'll go ahead and make that look nice by aligning the items to the center. So there's like a meme that goes around on the internet, and it's still being used as a trope today about being able to center something in CSS, and for some reason that's super difficult. That was the case for quite some time. That's not the problem anymore. We can actually use align item center. And if you are also going to set the justify item center on this, it would actually center everything to the middle of that flex box. And if your entire layout was a flex box, that would center the item in the middle of the screen. So now with 2 lines of code, you can center something in CSS. It's been a long time coming, but it's been that way for about 5 years now. And the memes still keep coming. So that just tells me people aren't familiar with these techniques yet. So there we go. There's our items displayed down the center of that. On the next one, I want to lay these out horizontally. The default is row, but I'm going to go ahead and explicitly set it here just so we can see that we're flexing in a row direction. And to space those items out nicely, we'll go ahead and set a gap of 20 pixels, and we'll justify those to the center. So you can see the difference between those 2 items. It looks a lot better than where we started. All right, so the next thing we're going to do is put these 2 concepts together. I'm going to add a couple new techniques in here as we do it. So we've got some actual Blazor components in here now. We've got weather today, weather high, low, and weather symbol, 3 components. And if we go to this page, it looks like this. So we're kind of building off of what we just made, but now they're inside of specific components. So we have weather high, low, weather today, and the weather symbol. They're all kind of sprawled out on the page. I want to put these inside of a nice grid so they make a nice weather display. So these are using CSS isolation. So you might see these weird deep selectors in here. This deep keyword is part of the Blazor framework. And it tells Blazor that if I have a child component, I'm going to go ahead and apply a selector to the child component and kind of reach out of the CSS isolation and apply something to my children. So the weather container, let's go ahead and set that to a grid and see what happens. So we'll just go ahead and set that to grid. Again, it's a 1-column grid. We're not going to see a whole lot of change here. So we'll go back again and we'll say grid column templates. And I want the second column to be twice the size as the first column. So it's 1 fraction by 2 fractions. And I get that. And that's not what I want. That doesn't look great. So what's happening here? All right. So we've got 4 columns, and the browser's doing what it thinks is the best to fill those columns. It took the source order of them, and the first items it threw in the first box, second box, third box. There's nothing to go in the 4th box. So we've got a nice big empty blank space there. There's also some nice tools here that we can dig into in the browser tools. And if I dig in to my layout here with the browser tools, and I zoom in, trying to zoom in as much as I can on the side here to check into the layout, you can see my weather container has a little grid button next to it. So if you click on the grid button, you'll actually see a highlight. It might be hard to see on the display up here, but there's a highlight of our grid. And if we hover over, we can see that this is our grid area. And there's also some numbered coordinates on this grid. So I'll try to zoom in here. And you'll see that the grid starts at 1, 1 and has a first, second, and there's actually a third grid column here. And it would be the start of the third column if there was a third one. Notice there's a -1 here as well. So they also get numbered backwards, which is really interesting. So we could define something in this grid by the negative values too. What's really cool here is there's a grid span feature. So it can tell the UI to span an element across the grid. And if I don't know how many rows are in the grid or how many columns are in the grid, I can say span from 1 to -1. -1's always going to be the other end. Doesn't matter how many columns I have. So if I say span 1 to -1, it's going to be the left-hand side to the right-hand side. Span all the way across all of the columns, regardless of how many columns there are. So we can move things around the grid with grid span and some other things. So let's go back into our code. And we'll apply one of those grid spans. So I'm going to say on my weather high low, go ahead and span 2 rows and or 2 columns. And I get this here. This still isn't quite what I want. It's getting close. I'd like to lay out this darker bar at the bottom of the screen, but the source order is not right. I've got this icon that's dangling down here at the bottom because it's defined third in my markup. So what I really need to do is get it in that other empty cell up there, and that'll free up the space on the bottom and make this look like a nice layout. As developers, you probably know that we don't always have control over what's being put in the source order. This might be a for each loop. Maybe these things are loading dynamically. We don't always have control over what's going to be there. But what we can do is we can use CSS to kind of move some things around. So I've got my weather symbol here, and I'm going to tell it to start at column 1, row 1, and span 1 column or 1 row. We'll save that. So what that's done is it's taken that third item out of source order and thrown it in the first row and first column cell and lets the rest of the layout flow normally. So now the browser is happy. It's got a place for each thing. There's no more big empty white space at the bottom. All right. So we could write an additional media query there to make this layout nicely on mobile and arrange those into columns. But we'll go ahead and save that for another day because I have some more demos that I want to show. There's some additional stuff that we might want to do. I talked a little bit about runtime. Like, what if we're getting stuff at runtime? We can actually perform runtime media queries in the browser using JavaScript. But who wants to write JavaScript? we got one person. That's okay if you want to write JavaScript. Blazor is probably not the thing you want to use then. I actually know quite a bit of JavaScript, so I wrote a library to help do media queries through a C# interface rather than having to use JavaScript directly. My partner was up here earlier, Sam. He was doing some stuff with screen sizes and having to write JavaScript. He could have just gone to NuGet and got my my package, but I like to see him struggle a little, so I let him write it in JavaScript himself. But Blazor size is out there. It's a really cool tool for querying the browser at runtime. And then we have a very similar component. Blazor size was kind of the pilot idea for the one that is inside of the Telerik UI for Blazor. So if you already have Telerik UI for Blazor, there's no need to go get Blazor size, you can already use the media query component inside of Telerik UI for Blazor, but there's some additional stuff inside of our Telerik UI components that I'm going to show as well. So let's start with another demo. I got to go ahead and make this one. It's a different project here, so I want to make this my default project. Yeah, stop running the other one. Come on, Visual Studio, let go of it. There we go. Visual Studio is really psyched about that project. All right, set that as startup project, and then we can go ahead and run this one. All right, so we've got something that we probably do as line of business developers a lot. We have a data grid. Data grids are notoriously bad for mobile. So there's very little we can do. We can make this flexible in the way that, we use a table element and we make sure that it's at least set to 100% width, and it can do a little bit of flexing there. We might be able to freeze some columns and things. There's some really cool features inside Telerik UI for Blazor that we could use. But this is a regular table. This actually, I think, the bootstrap table. But I've got some extra code inside of this one that does something really cool. When you go to a mobile device, it swaps that table out for cards. So now we can adapt our UIs. So we've taken it from responsive web, which is just using some basic CSS techniques, down to something that's using code at runtime that will actually swap out the UI for something that works better for mobile. Now, I started off saying this is a really exciting time for this stuff because of Maui. Just think about what you're able to do now with your Blazor applications that Maui is here, and maybe you're deploying your app to iOS and Android for the first time. Now you can go in and tweak some of your layouts so they look really spectacular inside of the mobile devices. All right, so let's take a look at how difficult or easy that was to do. It's going to leverage on a little bit of something we learned already. So I'm going to jump into a page here. I've got my fetch data example. It's similar to the fetch data example you might see in the default template, except I've modified it a bit. So you'll see an if statement wrapped around a couple things here. I've got an if statement that says is small. If it's small, I'm going to display a weather card component. It takes some data called weather forecasts or forecasts. I also have a weather grid component, and it takes the same data as the card component. So I don't really have to even change out my data source, although I could if I want. I could swap data sources too. You think, why might I want to do that? Well, if I'm on a mobile device, maybe I want to use less data. So maybe I'll request 5 records instead of 50. I could do that. So there's some additional things that we could do for mobile devices. The way that these Boolean flags work, this is small, is there's a component here called the media query component, and it points to a breakpoint. And you'll see here it says breakpoints only medium. And if we don't know what only medium and only small mean, you can kind of zoom in here. This always doesn't come out great because when I zoom, Visual Studio likes to put like a transparent layer here. But you can see this is just a media query. I could write that media query in line there. Max width is 767 pixels. So that's just a regular media query that you'd have in CSS. And what this is doing is it's querying the browser, and whatever media query string you put in here, it will give you an event. You can use that event to set a flag. You can use that event to swap some values out. You can do that. You can do whatever you'd like there. For this one, I've bound it to a Boolean flag called isSmall. So if it matches that media query, it will trigger that flag. I've got one for medium too. All it's doing is just writing out to the screen that we've hit that breakpoint, so I can show that we can have multiple of these. So if we go back to the demo, you'll see that text popping up as we get to the medium value there. There's the word medium at the bottom of that grid. It's just showing kind of a demo that we can identify multiple breakpoints at once. So we're able to swap out those UIs, and that's really nice. That's a free NuGet package. You can just grab off a NuGet, utilize that however you'd like. The next thing I want to show is from our Telerik libraries. Now, the Telerik libraries are a commercial product. You can try them for free for 30 days, but there's some really crazy stuff that we can do in here that I myself would take forever to write. We've got a team of people making these components, and we've baked in some adaptive rendering techniques into the Telerik UI stuff. So again, if you're wanting to focus on iOS and Android with your Blazor applications, this type of stuff is really going to be cool for you. So I have a product drop-down box here, and this is just a component that you get out of our Telerik UI for Blazor component library, and it binds to some data, lets you select from a drop-down list. I've also got a date range selector. Again, this would take me forever to build. It's got two date input boxes, and we can grab a range off of some calendars here, and it's going to fill the two boxes in for us. Those are two things that aren't very mobile friendly. Like, I'm not going to be sitting here trying to poke my finger at these dates and fill in these boxes. And these drop down lists can be kind of hokey when we're doing mobile. So what we've done, if I take this down to mobile, move that guy out of the way. If I were to tap this on mobile, I get a completely different UI. So instead of a little drop-down box I'm trying to put my finger on, I get a nice big box here that I can scroll and select from. I can even search at the top. So I can select from that. And then if I were to click this without mobile enabled, the calendar would spew off the screen somewhere, and I'd be trying to like pinch and zoom and do weird stuff to catch it. So if I click on this, you see it puts it in a nice pop-up for us. So we don't have to go chase after this little modal calendar that comes up and chase that around the screen. So almost all of our input components on Telerik UI for Blazor have this feature. All you have to do is go into your code. It's way easier even than what we did with the Blazor size library. So if I jump into my Telerik component, it's really easy to see here on the date range picker. I have a date range picker that binds to a start date and an end date. And all I have to do is come in here and tell it to set adaptive mode to automatic. That's it. So as long as adaptive is on automatic, it's going to detect a small device for me and give me the small device's UI. That's it for almost all of our inputs. And we're looking to see where we can expand this further. So more complex controls take more time to kind of break down into a better UX for mobile users. But you will see this come to things like our more complex things like calendar, or not calendar, but our scheduler components, stuff like that. So over time, we will have much more of this. And of course, there's that media query component baked into Telerik UI for Blazor as well. So it just takes one dependency out of the equation. You don't need Blazor size there. There is, however, one little thing that Blazor size does do that is not in Telerik UI for Blazor. It will detect a real-time screen size if you don't want to use breakpoints for some specific reason. I would always default to breakpoints first, but also has a way of detecting real-time as you scroll the screen smaller. It will give you events back with the actual screen width and height. Report that in real time. So hopefully these techniques will help you with your Blazor applications, or even with just regular HTML stuff. Again, these are all baked in features of HTML now and CSS. So CSS Grid, Flexbox are really powerful tools. If you look more into them, then you start to not rely so much on frameworks like Tailwind and Bootstrap. And you can just write some very simple CSS selectors and a little bit of code and lay out your entire application. There's really great tools inside the browser to debug these things now. So you can visualize the grid, visualize Flexbox. There's also inside these grid layouts, inside the browser, and jump back over to this guy for a second. You can even go in and toggle some of the values live inside the browser and see how they affect your layout. So we'll jump back over to Flexbox just for a second here. Right now I have today up at the top. Let's go ahead and look with our browser tools here. Try to select that one more time. So we have our little Flexbox button on the side here. We can tap that and it will highlight our Flexbox layout for us. And then we'll scroll up here a little bit. And there's another button here next to Display Flex that has some additional properties of the Flexbox on it. So we can play with this in real time if we want to change the flex direction. Let's go ahead and reverse that. And you can see the words got reversed as soon as I clicked that. The items got flipped from a top-down layout to a bottom-up layout. And we could do that right to left, left to right as well. So there's different centering options and things that you can toggle as well. If you don't know those off the top of your head, you just pull up the browser tools, click away at some of these, and get the properties that you need. Okay. I'll leave the resources up there. You can go to my website. I've got links to my GitHub page, our Twitch shows. And on my GitHub, there's lots of samples of applications and code for the resources here. The Blazor size NuGet package you can just find by a quick search on NuGet or inside of your GitHub or NuGet package manager. It's open source if you want to contribute something to it. And of course, visit telerik.com. Check out our free ebooks, plural. There's multiple Blazor ebooks out there. And of course, our amazing components that we have as well. Do we have questions or do we have time for questions?
We do have questions.
Okay.
First of all, we have a comment.
All right.
Awesome font sizes. Everyone could see it very clearly.
Amazing.
Yeah, good feedback.
Mm-hmm.
Also, in Grid, does it matter where we put the div? Can we always set the position from CSS?
In the grid, in the div, does it matter where we put? So there,
or the other way around. In Grid, it doesn't matter where we put the div. Can we set the position in CSS?
If they're referring to any of the divs that are here, then yes, it doesn't matter where they are in the source. That question might have came before my last demo, but yeah, you can move it around like I did in the weather display. You can move items around the grid by giving them individual coordinates.
That's awesome.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, the Blazor Pro Blazor size. So Blazor size.
Yes.
Can you allow us to query not only screen size but also device themes like dark mode?
Yes. So any media query that you can use in CSS, you can use with Blazor size. And there's quite a few media queries out there that aren't screen size related. Some of them are still not supported by all browsers, but there's one really cool one that is, and it's called prefers color or something like that. You can detect the user's theme on their system, just like I believe Maddie did that with Maui this morning. You can do the same exact thing with Blazor. You can target a media query on the user's preferred color theme, and then you can use a CSS file or some CSS code to swap that out. I actually have that in another presentation I did at SweetTug.
Does it detect if we change the preference when the page is loaded?
It depends.
Okay. So there might be a way?
It depends on how you apply the changes.
Oh.
So the media query should pick up the change in real time. And then depending on how you implement your theme, you might be able to change the theme in real time, or you might have to swap out an entire CSS file, which that can depend on whether you need to load the browser again or not.
Awesome. So it might be possible.
It is, but it depends on your implementation of it.
Yeah.
In my demo that I have, you can switch it in real time, and it doesn't matter.
Is it the demo from Sveto?
Yes.
Yes. So that video will be up on in a few weeks on Sveto.
Yeah, and there's in my issues on GitHub right now, there's actually an issue asking for a demo of it, and there's a link to one of my gist files that I did demo it there. So you can
Oh,
find it on my
perfect.
GitHub as well, kind of in a roundabout way right now, but I'm looking at fixing that, putting an actual demo online.
Perfect. Thank you. Do we have any questions here? Yes, we do.
All right.
I'm new to Blazor, so I'm not sure
Mhm.
is it a thing or not. So pop-ups.
Okay.
Because designers have fantasy, and mobile design is always something other thing, and most things which normally we would display as details are pop-ups. So in Xamarin we have RG pop-ups as well as pancake view. Is that a thing or not a thing for Blazor?
All right. So in regards to pop-ups, there's nothing that's inherent to the web. There's no default web component that does a modal or any sort of pop-up. So you have to either write something yourself, or you'd have to go to a third-party library. There are things in Telerik UI for Blazor that supply modals in different shapes and sizes. So you could actually target a media query on it using the media query component and say if it's a mobile device, then use the smallest modal there is. You can even set a specific width to make sure it doesn't pop out of the bounds of the mobile device. There's also some open source packages out there. I can't remember the name off the top of my head, but I think Chris Santee is the developer of one of them. Maybe Blazorized modal or something like that. I don't know if it's responsive, but there's some modal dialogue stuff out there.
Yeah, and the next example, for example, you had drop down.
Mhm.
In many cases, down in the how it will be displayed on mobile design, it's up to size of it, like size of items, like how many of them.
Mhm.
So, for example, if there are 5, it's a drop down, but if there are 20, it's a page, whole new navigation stack. Yeah.
So on drop downs, if the number of items,
It's
if
5.
if you wanted to show just a few, if you had like 5 items,
Yeah.
you might want to show a different UI for like
It's
more than
because of
5 items.
it's because of the size of a finger. Yes. So you
So
have to deal with those multiple things as a full page. Yeah.
okay, you could handle that through media queries. You could also use something like Blazor size to say if it's within this media query, only show so many or show them in a page or something like that. And then you could use regular CSS with the same media query to change the target size. I think that's what you might be going for. So make them a little bit wider so you can hit them with your finger easier. So you could use a combination of both things. So the nice thing about Blazor size and CSS media queries is you can use them together. So you can swap out UI elements, but you can also change the visual size of things if you need to using just plain CSS.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ed.
Okay.
And we will be back at 20 past with Stacy Cashmore. So we see you in a bit.